So over the past decade, wearable technology has just been quietly permeating through the consumer sector. Wearables have enabled consumers to track so many aspects of their daily lives: activity levels, stress levels, sleep patterns, athletic performance, you name it. It's probably being tracked, and it's pretty exciting. But for the most part, wearables have been designed for the active, the healthy, and the well. Today I want to talk to you about why I think there's actually a place for wearables in the hospital environment, and I want to show you how this type of technology can actually be used to help improve nursing practice. Before we do get started, I have an important conflict of interest that I need to mention. This presentation is certainly not designed to be a sales pitch, but we'll be talking about Leaf Healthcare, which is a company that I started during medical school. So please take everything I say with the appropriate grain of salt. So the problem that we're going to be discussing is one that I know everyone in here is very familiar with, and that's the problem of pressure injuries, pressure ulcers. According to a fairly recent national survey from the Joint Commission, about 1 out of every 30 hospitalized patients will end up developing a hospital-acquired pressure injury. Now, I know that number seems quite high, but this is based on an analysis of over 700,000 patient records from 1,500 hospitals across the country. And their data suggests that perhaps pressure injuries are more common than some of the administrative metrics might suggest. We all know these things are dangerous, they're costly. The average incremental unreimbursed cost of treating an average pressure injury is about $8,000, a little more. And these things account for about $10 billion in annual healthcare expenditure. And of course, because they're considered preventable never events, they're not reimbursable. And the treatment costs are really just the tip of the iceberg. Pressure injuries tend to have a rippling effect through an organization. They can affect quality metrics, of course, which are being increasingly tied to reimbursement. They affect hospital reputation, length of stay, and on and on and on. But beyond the financial implications, I think as care providers, as clinicians, we have a professional obligation to try to do everything we can to help prevent these things from happening and spare the patients the pain and suffering associated with these injuries. Before we dive into the technology, I thought I'd just provide a little bit of historical background and context. And it's interesting, not that long ago, relatively speaking, bed rest was actually considered therapeutic. For centuries, there was this belief that if you were sick, you should not expend any energy. You should stay in bed and rest and recuperate, and that was felt to be recuperative and restorative. It was felt that the less movement that you would do, the better. And for many, many years, the concept of bed rest was ingrained into the fabric of patient care. And of course, we know today there could be nothing further from the truth. It turns out that the human body is designed to be in motion, even when you're sick, especially when you're sick. And when it's not, bad things happen. And in recent years, there's just been this tidal wave of research that has shown the benefits of mobilizing patients, repositioning patients, getting them out of bed, ambulating them, and so forth. And this wave of research has now allowed us to finally step away from that outdated practice of bed rest. And of course, the benefits of repositioning and mobilization extend beyond just pressure injury prevention. Research has shown that immobility is linked to a number of serious and costly hospital complications: pneumonias, falls, DVTs, muscle deconditioning. And by improving patient mobility, we can expect fewer complications, reduced length of stay, improved functional status at discharge, decreased readmission rates, and just an overall reduction in the cost of care. And I believe that mobility really truly is a form of medicine. Today we're going to focus on one of the most common complications of immobility, and of course that's pressure injuries. So about 150 years ago or so, during the Crimean War, Florence Nightingale is credited with introducing the concept of turning protocols into nursing practice. And today, virtually every hospital in the country has some form of a turning protocol to help prevent pressure injuries. And the concept is very simple. All you need to do is identify patients that are at risk for pressure injuries and make sure that they're turning on a regular basis, such as every 2 hours, around the clock, day and night. And despite the apparent simplicity, I think we'd all recognize that it's actually fairly difficult to execute this in actual practice, just because the practice environment is so busy and it's so interrupt-driven. And staff are task saturated, they've got a high cognitive load, there's a lot of competing priorities, and it's very easy for patient turning to slip through the cracks. To help, there's been many different reminder systems that have been employed over the years. A very common one is manual documentation and charting of patient positioning. The limitation with this is that this is often done retrospectively at the end of a shift, for example, and it may be an incomplete assessment of patient mobility, or it may not perfectly represent the actual position history of the patient, because some repositioning events may have been unwitnessed and therefore undocumented. Some hospitals use musical chimes, which are played overhead every 2 hours, for example, and every patient is supposed to be turned on cue, which is difficult to say the least, and perhaps not even clinically warranted in some cases. Other hospitals use paper turn clocks. You put a paper turn clock over the head of the bed, and that suggests that a patient should be on their right side between 12 and 2, and their left side between 2 and 4, and around you go. And unfortunately, I think patients don't always nicely fit into such a regimented structure like that. But just because we've been doing it this way for the past 150 years doesn't mean we necessarily need to keep doing it this way for the next 150 years. Technology is revolutionizing healthcare in so many exciting ways. I'm sure everybody's been hearing a lot about machine learning and artificial intelligence and expert systems. And in today's busy healthcare environment, we need to leverage technology-assisted decision support tools to help improve care delivery. And that's what LEAF is all about. So LEAF is a patient-centric care system that's designed to intelligently and efficiently and effectively coordinate and optimize patient turning and mobility protocols. And the system is designed to make sure that we turn the right patient at the right time and at the right dose. So at the core of the system is the LEAF wearable patient sensor. Small, lightweight, single-use, disposable. It attaches to the patient's upper chest, and it starts monitoring every single movement that patient makes, every activity event. And it sends that data wirelessly to a central server, and all of that data is crunched and analyzed, and ultimately the data is provided through a user interface which is available on any web-enabled device. And the message to staff is very simple. It's green, yellow, red. If the patient's green, that means the patient's been turning and mobilizing enough on their own. Everything's been documented, you don't have to worry about it. If it's yellow, it means that if the patient doesn't turn within the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, they could probably benefit from some help with repositioning. And if the patient's red, that means that they could probably benefit from a repositioning event to help mitigate the risk of pressure-induced ischemia. So while on the surface the message is very simple, green, yellow, red, under the hood it's actually a little bit more complicated, and there's a lot going on. And for each patient, what's happening is that LEAF sensor on the patient's chest is creating what we call an orientation-based surface pressure distribution map for the patient. And I know that's a mouthful, but what it means is that the system is figuring out roughly where on the patient's body pressure is being exerted, and it's integrating that information over time. And it's figuring out whether or not the patient is at risk for any pressure-induced ischemia. And of course, the system is accounting for all spontaneous movements. So if the patient is doing enough shifting and moving on their own, or if they get out of bed, get to a chair, if they walk, all of that stuff is being accounted for. And the system will determine automatically whether or not repositioning is necessary. And the system coordinates three components of the pressure injury prevention equation. And the first one, I think, is one that everyone's familiar with. That's this concept of turn frequency. So the system makes sure that turns are happening at with sufficient frequency to prevent an injury. The second one is the turn angle, or the turn dose, which I think is very intuitive, but historically not something that we've really been able to monitor or coordinate because we haven't had an instrument to do so. And the dosing element of this equation, I think, is very important, perhaps as important or maybe even more important than the turn frequency. And what the Leaf system does is, through its analysis of the patient's position history, it knows exactly how far a patient needs to be turned in order to mitigate an injury. And the way it works in actual practice is you just rub the top of the Leaf sensor, it lights up, it will tell you which direction a patient may or may not need to be turned, and then as you're turning a patient, you get immediate feedback. It will turn green and tell you that the patient's been turned enough. Very simple. The third component of the pressure injury prevention equation is reperfusion time. And this is one that is perhaps new, but I think it's important, and I think it's something you may be hearing more about. But it's this idea that if there has been an ischemic insult, so say the patient was in the operating room for 4, 5, 6 hours or so, and they come back to the ICU, the patient likely has experienced an ischemic insult. And let's say that patient is turned and turned sufficiently. If the patient immediately flips right back onto that position that they just were for the past 6 hours, there likely has not been enough time for that tissue to recover. And the Leaf system figures out, based on the patient's position history, how much time is required for reperfusion, how much time is required for oxygen to come in, for nutrients to come in, for all the toxic metabolites to be flushed back. And it will warn you if a patient has not had sufficient time for reperfusing their tissues. And again, while all that's fairly complicated, the message on the surface, very simple: green, yellow, red. So to test whether wearable technology can actually have a meaningful impact on patient care, a very large randomized controlled trial was conducted here at Stanford. And this was an investigator-initiated study, so Leaf was not involved in the study design or recruitment or data collection or interpretation of any of the results. This was a study that was prospective, forward-looking. It was blinded to the extent possible. There were parallel arms. It was pragmatic, meaning it was done in a real-world clinical environment, not a hyper-controlled research setting that doesn't reflect clinical reality. And the study was also high-powered, so there were over 1,200 patients enrolled over about 6 months in 2 ICUs. It was about 100-some thousand hours of data collected, so a phenomenally large data set. This is perhaps one of the largest and most scientifically rigorous studies that has been conducted in the field of pressure injury prevention. And the manuscript was actually just accepted. It'll be in next month's issue of the International Journal of Nursing Studies, and it's available now online ahead of print. So the way the study was designed, over about 6 months, consecutive patients were enrolled. About 1,200 of them were randomized to either a control group or a treatment group. And again, these groups ran in parallel, side by side. And every patient that was enrolled in the study was given a Leaf sensor, and that Leaf sensor was monitoring every single movement that patient made. In the control group, the data from the Leaf sensor, while it was being collected, it was not provided to staff. So staff were instructed to just use all the traditional reminders and documentation, but they were not able to benefit from the guidance of the Leaf system. And in the treatment group, the instructions were just to use the Leaf system. If the Leaf system suggests that a turn is required, go ahead and turn the patient. If not, you don't need to necessarily worry about it. And the results were very interesting and quite compelling. First, Leaf was found to significantly improve the overall positioning index for patients, which is a reflection of how often and how well patients are being turned. And in patients at risk for pressure injuries, there was a 43% relative improvement in the positioning for this group of patients. The Leaf system helped ensure that turns were happening with sufficient frequency and with sufficient quality as well. And this improvement in patient positioning translated into a very significant reduction in rates of pressure injuries. In patients randomized to the treatment group, there was a 73% reduction in the incidence of HOPEs. These results are not only clinically significant, they were statistically significant with a p-value of 0.01. So I believe this is pretty compelling evidence that wearable technology can actually be used to help improve patient outcomes and nursing practice. This study also objectively examined what happens to patients that are prescribed the standard of care. The data I'm about to show you is also accepted for publication. This will be published in an upcoming edition of Wounds. And what was found was that in patients that were not having their care coordinated by LEAF, that control group, there were significant disparities in the care that was provided. So for example, there was significant variability in patient turning based on the time of day. Notably during the night shift, there was a very dramatic and consistent reduction in patient turning, which may or may not be intentional. Perhaps this was designed to help minimize sleep fragmentation or disruptions of sleep, but perhaps this lack of movement at night may increase the HOPE risk. We don't know. But what's probably not intentional is the significant variability that exists based on gender and BMI. It turns out that men are turned significantly less often than women. And this incidentally may explain why recent national audits and analyses have shown that men actually have a higher HOPE rate than women. BMI was also very strongly correlated with patient turning, which I guess is not all that surprising, but obese patients get turned significantly less often than their non-obese counterparts. What this graph is showing here is that if you happen to be an obese male, you are going to be turned about 50% less effectively than if you were a non-obese female. So it's a very significant care disparity. Interestingly, with LEAF, these biases tend to disappear. And I think that's why the technology results in a significant reduction in rates of pressure injuries. The wearable allows you to identify care disparities in real time so that you can deliver a high-quality pressure injury prevention program to all patients, regardless of the time of day, the gender, the BMI, all those other factors. So as we think about the hospital of the future, it's hard for me to imagine patient turning being coordinated based on clinical observation and traditional reminders and just intuition alone. I believe that technology will revolutionize this fundamental care practice and allow us to provide care in a more efficient and more effective manner. I believe it's only a matter of time before we step away from those cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all approaches to patient turning. I think that computers will be able to tell us exactly who needs to be turned, when they should be turned, and by how much they should be turned. I think that soon we'll have individualized, patient-centered turning protocols where computers will automatically assign an appropriate turning intervention based on an analysis of the patient's electronic medical record and an assessment of their comorbidities. I think that all of the documentation will be completely automated so we can get out of the chart and get back to the bedside. I think the data analytics will allow us to truly optimize care in a way that we could never before. Because if you can't monitor something, it's very difficult to manage it effectively. And ultimately, I think wearables will allow us to improve care in a way that Florence Nightingale never could have imagined. And I think as a true innovator in her own right, I believe Florence would be excited by the evolution that's happening in pressure injury prevention. So, thank you.